The New York Central Railroad. Truly a wondrous thing to behold. One of the finest lines in American history. In existence for over 100 years, but now, no longer. Why did this company collapse? Well, let's talk about it, boys. New York Central is one of the most famous railroads in American history, and in its original form, it's actually a combination, a merger, of a whole bunch of different very small lines. The earliest of those would probably be the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad. That particular railroad was chartered all the way back in 1826. It was one of the earliest railroads ever chartered and built in general, and it covered 16 miles between Albany and Schenectady, opening for business on August 9th, 1831, and in those days, it pretty much only handled passenger service. Now, why would that be? Because freight is super lucrative. In the modern day, the vast majority of American trains carry freight, and trains are very efficient for moving stuff around, both people and goods, so it's a deal here. Well, that had to do with the state of New York, and them being, frankly, irritating. See, about the same time that railroads started becoming a thing, they had finished the Erie Canal, and they weren't about to lose a whole bunch of that freight traffic to the railroads, so they restricted the lines from handling freight movements, or if they did, they would have to pay the state a toll. This meant that in the early days, a lot of New York's railroads just simply couldn't move freight. It wasn't financially reasonable for them to do so because of the state, but that would change over time. Over the following years, a bunch of other lines would spawn in New York that were initially separate, and growth really spiked in December of 1851 when New York finally canceled the canal tolls on the railroads, and thus they were free to move as much freight as they wanted to, and their profits went through the roof after that. But they wouldn't all join hands until 1853, when the owner of the Mohawk Valley Railroad, Erastus Corning, negotiated everyone to start working together, consolidating all the railroads into one system. On March 17th of 1853, the agreement was finalized, and the lines all became New York Central. Under Erastus, they continued to grow, acquiring other smaller lines that hadn't been involved in the initial merger. But there was a major management shakeup in 1867. Enter Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose name is synonymous with money, up there with Rockefeller, Carnegie, Gates. The man was an astonishingly successful businessman, and he was just loaded. And I assure you, a big portion of his fortune came from New York Central. In 1867, he acquired control, and on November 1st, 1869, he merged New York Central with his own Hudson River Railroad to form the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, but nobody ever calls it that. It's just New York Central. A fun fact about Vanderbilt, besides the fact that I have my own standalone video about his life, he was actually afraid of trains. Nah, seriously, he didn't ride them. Well, he rode them once, but he was unfortunate enough to be in a pretty bad accident, and he never rode them again after that. But that didn't mean he couldn't capitalize on them.
To capitalism!
And he was good at managing the lines. Real good. He had made part of his fortune operating steamships, but the railroads were something else entirely. Also, over here in America, we can credit him with the reason why the vast majority of our steam locomotives are black. See, as some of you might be aware, steam locomotives produce smoke, and the smoke tends to contain things like soot and ash, and it makes locomotives pretty dirty. In the early days of American operations, our locomotives were colorful just like the UK's tend to be, but this meant they had to be cleaned more often because you could see all the dirt. And Vanderbilt was like, yeah, but, what if we just paint the locomotives black? And thus, the vast majority of our steam locomotives were painted black, just like my soul. Now, the area that incorporates New York and the whole of New England was going through a significant population increase at the time. There were a lot of immigrants that were coming into New York Harbor, and people were just having more kids, frankly. The point was, plenty of people and their stuff had to be moved. So the railroad, being the best way to move anything back then, just printed money, and through various other maneuverings, stock buyouts, and things of that nature, Vanderbilt made New York Central just that much bigger. And even after he died, it didn't slow the railroad down, and acquired trackage that went far beyond New York, as far west as Illinois. Their extensive range put them in direct competition with the ever-present Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad was also quite large, and highly successful as well, and the two were rivals for nearly a century, as they served generally the same areas. Their lines often ran parallel to each other. You can't be much more directly in competition than that. And in terms of their trains, they generally stuck with steam. There were a few sections where they did attempt electrification, but they didn't get nearly as crazy with it as Pennsylvania would, for example. In New York Central's case, they only electrified where they absolutely had to, mostly due to city ordinances. Again, steam engines produce smoke. And in the city, they didn't necessarily want all that smoke all the time. But electric locomotives didn't do that. So they utilized electric where it was necessary, but not beyond that. They stuck with steam for most of their existence. Did they now? Not yet, Perlman, it's not time for you. The thing about New York Central that was quite nice is that they were usually blessed with very good management. They always seemed on top of themselves and handled themselves quite well. They were one of only a handful of railroads that got through the Great Depression without entering bankruptcy. That doesn't happen very often. If you've seen my other railroad videos, almost all of them did that, but New York Central was one of the exceptions. They did not have to enter bankruptcy, even though they were going through it pretty hard. Their profits had fallen, but not to the point that they were at risk of shutting down. And once the World War II boom hit, New York Central, just like all the railroads, were in overdrive, moving any and all things to help with the war effort. They were insanely profitable during those years, but it was right after the war ended that everything changed. Despite enjoying nearly a century of success, once the 1950s hit, New York Central was, in fact, nearly bankrupt. Pennsylvania Railroad was no better. People just weren't riding trains anymore. Passenger revenue especially had dried up, and freight traffic was being hurt by the existence of trucks. The boom of the automobile market and the truck market meant that railroads were struggling under a strain that they'd never experienced before. For over a century, they had been the best way to travel, but now everyone was buying a car, and believe me, affordable air travel also didn't help. The company would need to do something drastic in order to innovate, in order to change something, anything to fix what was happening, but they didn't have much wiggle room. This was partially due to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which has come up a lot in these railroad videos when it comes to America, and there's a good reason for that. The ICC, as I've mentioned in the past, was a government entity that was responsible for regulating the rates that railroads could set. Now, when they were first introduced, they made a lot of sense, because in those days, railroad tycoons were charging whatever they wanted, slashing prices, increasing prices. It was nuts. And it was very anti-consumer because the railroads didn't have a real competitor at the time, besides each other. But when a lot of the tycoons owned most of the railroads and had effective monopolies, you can see how this was also a problem. It also caused a lot of antitrust laws to be passed to prevent that exact thing. But the ICC still needed to be there to make sure the rates were fair. The problem was that bureaucracy was based off of a time when, like I said, there were no competitors to railroads outside of other railroads. But planes and cars were a thing now. This has completely changed the game. But the ICC didn't care about that. They didn't alter themselves in any way, which meant that the railroads found it completely impossible to adjust their rates to actually stay competitive with these other factors. And New York Central specifically depended a lot on their long-distance passenger service. They had several different express trains that were very famous, such as the 20th Century Limited that ran from New York to Chicago. That train in particular existed for over 60 years. But traffic with them was again drying up. No one was riding anymore. And they were additionally burdened by taxes, substantial taxes, from governments that felt that rail infrastructure was a really good source of property tax revenues. So those rates were set fairly high. And historically that had been fine because the railroads were highly profitable. But now they weren't. So the tax was dragging them down quite quickly. Oh, just so we're clear, the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 that created a network of a whole bunch of highways for people to drive on? Yeah, those taxes weren't imposed on them. So that's friggin' neat. And during World War II, the government had imposed a 15% tax on passenger fares. The reason for this was actually to discourage travel by train because they needed the lines open for freight movements for the war, you know. And again, during World War II, this was completely reasonable because the railroads were making a ton of money with all the freight movements. But that 50% tax wasn't repealed after the war ended. Do you want to know when it was repealed? 1962! That's 17 years after the war was over! What are you people doing? So yeah, no one was really helping the railroads at all in the government, whatsoever. And New York Central was stuck between multiple hard places. And multiple rocks, really, is where they were at. But their situation wasn't any different from pretty much any other rail line in America in those days. It was all a mess. In June of 1954, they had a pretty major management shakeup. A proxy fight was initiated, and the old management of the line lost it to a man named Robert Ralph Young and his Allegheny Corporation. They were a real estate and railroad developer built up in the 1920s. They had controlled both Chesapeake and Ohio and nickel plate. And while this sort of takeover can often lead to really bad things for a company, in New York Central's case, this was probably the best thing that could have happened to them. Young was good with railroads. He was indeed the kind of person that should have been able to fix New York Central, but he stumbled into a hot mess that he didn't even expect. The railroad was in far worse condition than he thought it would be, which meant he needed some help. And there was an individual that Young was familiar with. A man that had also made a name for himself in railroad management. Someone who was known as a bit of a visionary, a savant of the craft. The man, the myth, the legend. Alfred E. Perlman. Now, I have historically made a meme out of Perlman, but I can't stress enough that he was a really good railroader, without question. His management style and his decision-making when it came to railroads was top tier, second to basically none, and Young brought him in because, frankly, as good as Young was, he knew he was gonna need some help. But even with Perlman working alongside him, Young found that the situation at New York Central was completely unmanageable, at least not in a timely fashion. There weren't changes they could make overnight that would fix their troubles. It would take some time. And that meant that Young was put in a position where he couldn't keep basically any of the promises he had made to take control of the railroad in the first place. He was forced to suspend dividend payments in January of 1958. This failure affected him deeply. He was depressed, and later on in that same month, he took his own life at his Palm Beach, Florida mansion. His roles were taken over by Perlman, but Perlman was just as capable as Young had thought. His reputation had preceded him, but in the best way possible. He lived up to the hype. Starting in 1959, Perlman had been able to reduce operating deficits by $7.7 million, which raised their stock value, and they were able to start paying dividends again. By 1964, he reduced their long-term debt by nearly $100 million, while cutting their passenger deficits in half. How the heck was he doing all this? Was he cooking the books? No! Legitimate management, actually. In his case, it was streamlining and cost-cutting. He pushed for modernization across the board, introducing some basic things that railroads still use now in the modern day, like centralized traffic control, or CTC systems. These systems let them reduce their 4-track main line to just 2 tracks at no loss in efficiency. He oversaw the construction or modernization of new classification yards, though he did have to cut things that people weren't particularly happy about in some cases. He didn't have much of a choice. For example, he had to curtail a lot of their services, such as the commuter lines, but he did this because they were simply not profitable. They couldn't sustain them anymore. Though most of the commuter service remained alive around the larger cities like New York City, for example, because the government's mandated that the railroads still operate due to the immense need for public transportation. Oh yeah, one other minor detail. He also got rid of all the steam engines. You knew this was coming. Boys, where on earth are all those steam engines? You already got rid of them, boss. I did?
Oh yeah, you already finished your modernization. We have nothing but diesels now. So, yeah, good work, I guess.
Oh, well, I'm just not even sure what to do with myself at this point. You don't have anything to do? Well, no, I was planning on destroying all the steam engines over the next few months. I forgot I already did that. Have you tried getting a hobby? Scrapping steam locomotives is my hobby. You realize you're gonna run out of those at some point.
Well, I hope not. I still don't even know what one is.
Barry, please. A lot of the long-distance and regional passenger trains were discontinued or downgraded in service. Again, in an effort to save money. They had to do all this in order to stay alive. Even the famous 20th Century Limited finally ceased operations on December 3rd, 1967. But as time wore on, it was realized that perhaps the problem was that the market was too oversaturated. There were too many different railroads, and given the limited nature of the market, they all couldn't be competing with each other. They were starving each other out. No one was making a profit. Thus, a lot of them began to look into the option of merging in order to both become larger, but also stop competing with each other so much. Then they could focus on being profitable as one, rather than sniping at one another. It did make sense, and a lot of the other railroads did do this, and New York Central eventually did so as well. But in their case, it didn't go well. See, New York Central tried to merge with a lot of other railroads. Perelman was looking for basically anybody that wasn't named Pennsylvania. This wasn't just because the Pennsylvania Railroad had been their main historic rival. That was part of it, but the bigger issue was that he genuinely didn't believe that Pennsylvania could be in as good a shape as they portrayed. He was correct, but no one else around them was willing or able to merge with them. And even the process of getting to the point of actually merging was a Christmas nightmare because the ICC dragged their heels on allowing it, because yes, they are the ones that approve mergers too, not just the rates. One of the major disagreements that kept happening was which company was going to retain controlling interest in the merger. Perelman felt that it should be New York Central because they were in a much more financially healthy situation than Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania's president, Stuart T. Saunders, put more pressure on the ICC to allow them to simply absorb the New York Central. For the ICC's part, they would allow the merger to go ahead, but only if both companies agreed to also take the bankrupt New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, or simply just the New Haven, into their new larger system. And neither Pennsylvania nor New York Central wanted to do that. But the ICC demanded that be the case, and Perelman was forced to go along with it. On February 1st, 1968, the New York Central was absorbed by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and this new merger would be dubbed Penn Central. And then it all exploded. Like, immediately. I have a whole video detailing the absolute abysmal, disgusting mess that was Penn Central, but everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. The trains never ran where they were supposed to, line quality diminished, and they were hemorrhaging money every single day. There are many reasons why this went so poorly. After all, Perelman was made the president of Penn Central. He was good at his job. Why couldn't he handle this? Other than the fact that Penn Central was a monster, that would have been difficult for anybody, no matter how good, to manage. Perelman wasn't even really allowed to manage Penn Central. If he could have, I'm sure it would have turned out at least a little bit better. The reason for this is the Pennsy Brass. Penn Central's board had former members of both the Pennsylvania and the New York Central Railroad. The New York Central guys, under Perelman, were very forward-thinking, innovators. They wanted to move the company forward. But the Pennsy Brass were exceedingly set in their ways. They refused to cooperate.
You want me to cooperate?
Insisting that they keep doing things the same way they always had for the last 100 or so years. But those things weren't working anymore. This was Perelman's issue, and he felt they should be trying to move the company forward, but the Pennsy Brass wouldn't budge. It didn't help that Saunders managed to negotiate a deal with their unions. And by negotiate, I mean give them every single thing they wanted. All of it. And in a perfect world, that is reasonable, but what Saunders wound up giving to the unions was well in excess of what the company could actually afford. They even hired back employees they had laid off in the past, winding up with a surplus of workers that often stood around with literally no work to actually do, while getting paid. That's not how this works, guys. And the merger that was designed to save both New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad from bankruptcy wound up destroying both of them, completely and utterly. They declared bankruptcy on June 21st, 1970, and at the time it was the largest in United States history. They were deep in debt, and the problem was that Penn Central encompassed so much territory that them not being able to operate properly put a chokehold on the economy, a significant part of the United States economy. If Penn Central shut down, it would kill a whole bunch of industries who depend on the railroads to move their stuff. And that included other smaller railroads that had nothing to do with Penn Central. The result was that the government had no choice but to actually step in and do something to help the rail lines. You know, the thing they hadn't been doing for the past couple decades or so.
Please, you give me too little credit.
This would result in two different organizations. Amtrak, which took over the operation of most of the regional and long-distance intercity passenger trains in the United States, as well as Conrail, which pretty much took over all of Penn Central, as well as a few other bankrupt railroads' freight movements. Conrail would also struggle at first, but they would eventually be profitable due to the passing of new government legislation that shrank the government's control over the railroad industry. It allowed them to set competitive rates again, and they were able to be profitable. Eventually, though, they would be divided between Norfolk Southern and CSX. While New York Central is no more, their trackage remains. A lot of their main lines are still used in the modern day, mostly under CSX, who inherited the majority of their former territory. Despite the way it ended, honestly, I can't help but look at the story and think this really wasn't New York Central's fault. Merging with Pennsylvania may have been a mistake, but Perlman didn't even want to do that. And had he been allowed to actually do his job, perhaps Penn Central wouldn't have turned out quite as catastrophic as it did. I'm not saying it would have been a grand success, but I'm sure it would have been better had you actually listened to the man. For his part, Perlman was actually forced to step down as president into a lame duck position, while Penn Central continued to writhe and try to pretend like everything was okay. He would simply leave after that, and go across the country to help out Western Pacific, and fix all of their problems and make them super profitable. But New York Central is still fondly remembered, even to this day. They have some of the most famous locomotives in history under their roster, and a few did survive into preservation. Not nearly as many as they probably could have put into preservation, because Perlman scrapped the majority of the steam engines, including all the Niagaras and all the Hudsons, and I'm still not over it. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Some Dude 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Rainwaters, Perez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131 Just 232, Mark Holding, Mr. Terrevel, Hayden DeGrow, Bad Train Puns Are Best, Kirk Forkham, Mr. Sleepy, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duraushi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Jared Brussel, Zintac M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, The Conceptualist, Acoletti, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Videolaw, AET Museum, NJ 1969, Extra Special J, Jonathan Coco, Kieran Tibbetts, DFL Church, Murder Drosdal, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.